At first, it sounded like an ordinary royal disagreement, a private argument between a king and his queen, something that, like so many difficult moments inside a long marriage, would eventually pass behind closed doors. But according to the account presented in the source material, this was something far more serious. The claim was that King Charles had reached a breaking point with Queen Camilla, and that, in the heat of an explosive confrontation, he demanded that she leave the palace and even return the engagement ring he had once given her. If that sounds extraordinary, consider what that ring represented. It was not simply a piece of jewelry. It had belonged to the Queen Mother. It had been placed on Camilla's finger at the beginning of a marriage that had taken decades to reach. And now, according to the report, Charles wanted it back. But before we can understand why such a moment would carry so much weight, we have to go back to the beginning. Because the story of Charles and Camilla was never simply a royal love story. It was a story of duty, resistance, public anger, family wounds, and ultimately, acceptance. And the question that hangs over the entire story is this: if their relationship survived everything that came before, what could possibly bring it to the edge now? For weeks, according to the source account, there had been a sense that something inside the palace was not quite right. Nothing necessarily visible to the public, no dramatic announcement, no public confrontation, just tension. The sort of tension that, within a tightly controlled institution, can become noticeable long before the outside world understands what is happening. Charles had spent much of his life valuing order, tradition, and careful presentation. Every public appearance mattered. Every word mattered. Every decision made by senior members of the royal family could affect the wider image of the monarchy. And then, according to the report, Camilla began appearing increasingly independent. She was undertaking solo engagements. She was delivering speeches. She was speaking publicly about her role. And most importantly, the account claimed that she had given an interview without the expected palace approval. On the surface, that might sound like a relatively minor matter. But inside an institution where communications are carefully managed, an unscheduled interview can carry much greater significance. What made the situation more sensitive, according to the source, was what Camilla allegedly said during that interview. She reportedly spoke confidently about her position within the monarchy and appeared to hint at the future in ways that had not been discussed privately. And suddenly, the issue was no longer simply about an interview. It became a question of authority. Who was deciding what the Queen should say? Who was controlling the message? And how much independence could Camilla exercise without creating tension with the king himself? According to the account, Charles was furious. The report portrays him as a man who believed he had spent decades preparing for the responsibilities of the crown, trying to modernize the monarchy while preserving its traditions. Now, he allegedly felt that the person standing closest to him was taking a different path. And that was where the confrontation supposedly began. The source describes Charles demanding that Camilla leave the palace immediately. He allegedly questioned her about the interview, asking why she had not consulted him or the palace before making such significant statements. Camilla, according to the same account, did not simply retreat. She defended herself. Her position, as described in the report, was that becoming queen did not mean becoming silent. She believed she had a role of her own to play. And that distinction was crucial, because Charles was reportedly no longer seeing the matter as a disagreement over public relations. To him, according to the account, it had become a question of loyalty and trust. The argument intensified, and then came the moment that transformed the entire story. The report claims that Charles demanded the return of Camilla's engagement ring. For a moment, according to the account, Camilla simply stood there, because that ring carried a history far greater than its value. It was a diamond ring associated with the Queen Mother, a piece of jewelry with royal provenance. But more importantly, it had become one of the most recognizable symbols of Charles and Camilla's relationship. It represented a journey that had begun decades earlier, a relationship that had survived separation, public hostility, the collapse of Charles's marriage to Diana, years of criticism, and eventually, marriage itself. So when the report claims Charles demanded the ring back, the significance was not really the diamond, it was what the diamond represented. and according to the account, Camilla eventually removed it. There was no dramatic scene described, no pleading, no attempt to fight. Instead, the report portrays her as quietly placing the ring on a nearby table before beginning preparations to leave. But was this really the end of their marriage? Or was the entire confrontation being interpreted far beyond what had actually happened? That question would become even more important as the story moved beyond the palace walls. According to the source account, Windsor Castle was suddenly thrown into confusion. Camilla was reportedly preparing to leave that very night. Staff members allegedly gathered only the essentials. There was no time for the sort of careful preparation normally associated with royal travel. No elaborate departure, no public farewell. The account describes an atmosphere of disbelief among those working nearby. For years, Camilla had stood beside Charles through some of the most difficult chapters of his life. And now, according to the report, she was leaving Windsor. A royal vehicle was said to have arrived at a private entrance. Camilla allegedly traveled with only a trusted lady-in-waiting and a protection officer. Then the vehicle disappeared into the night. Inside the palace, the source claims Charles remained in his chambers, and by morning, the situation had supposedly become something far larger than a private disagreement. Senior advisors were called, emergency discussions were held, and the palace was confronted with a familiar but dangerous problem. How do you respond when a private royal matter threatens to become a public crisis? The monarchy depends not only on what happens, but on how those events are understood. Silence can create rumors. A statement can create even more questions. And according to the account, the palace was now facing both. Camilla's scheduled engagements were reportedly attracting attention. Questions began circulating about her whereabouts. The press wanted answers. And behind the scenes, according to the source, there was a much larger concern. Was this simply an argument between husband and wife? Or had something much deeper begun to fracture? Prince William and Catherine were reportedly informed of the situation. The account says they were shocked. For William, the situation would have carried a particularly difficult weight. He had spent his life watching his father carry the burdens of monarchy, but this was described as something more personal. A family dispute had suddenly become a matter with potential consequences for the institution itself. And yet, to understand why the ring could become such a powerful symbol, we have to return to the extraordinary history that came before it. Because Camilla's place beside Charles was never guaranteed. In fact, for many years, it seemed almost impossible. Charles and Camilla's relationship had begun long before the world saw them as husband and wife. According to the source account, Camilla was the woman Charles had loved for years. But royal life did not always allow people to marry the person they loved. In the 1970s, Camilla was not regarded as the ideal bride for a future king. She came from an aristocratic background, but the royal establishment expected something more. There was an image to protect. A future queen was expected to embody a particular kind of public ideal. And Camilla, according to the account, did not fit neatly into that image. Charles eventually married Diana. Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles. And the two people who had once been together moved onto separate paths. But according to the source, their feelings did not simply disappear. By the time their relationship became known to the wider public, it had become one of the most controversial subjects surrounding the royal family. Then came Diana's famous interview. Her words about there being 3 people in her marriage became one of the defining moments of the entire controversy. The public reaction was enormous. For many people, Diana represented the fairy tale princess whose marriage had collapsed. Camilla, by contrast, became associated with everything that had gone wrong. The wounds were still fresh, and even after Diana's death, her influence remained deeply embedded in the public imagination. Camilla therefore faced an extraordinary challenge. She was not merely entering the royal family, she was entering a story in which millions of people had already chosen sides. And for years, according to the source, she remained in the background. The relationship had to be handled carefully. Her public appearances were limited, her position was gradually introduced, and even within royal circles, acceptance was far from immediate. The source account states that in 2002, Sir Michael Peat became Charles's private secretary, and initially sought to create distance between Charles and Camilla, but eventually, according to the report, it became clear that separating the couple was not going to work. Charles was determined. He had already lost Camilla once. He did not appear willing to lose her again. So the strategy changed. Instead of trying to end the relationship, the focus became making it acceptable. That meant gradually winning over influential figures, the palace, government officials, religious leaders, and, most importantly, the British public. The transformation could not happen overnight. Camilla had to be introduced into royal life slowly, carefully, deliberately. The goal was not to force acceptance, but to make her presence increasingly familiar. And even then, one of the most important obstacles remained: the Queen. According to the source account, Queen Elizabeth II had been uncomfortable with the relationship. In 1998, she reportedly attended an event where Camilla was present but did not speak to her. It was a quiet but unmistakable signal. Camilla had not yet received wholehearted acceptance from the very heart of the institution she hoped eventually to join. But Charles continued, and gradually, the situation changed. By 2005, according to the source, the Queen had accepted the reality that Charles and Camilla were going to marry. Yet even then, the manner of that acceptance was significant. She did not attend their civil wedding ceremony. Instead, she hosted the reception afterwards. It was acknowledgement, but it was not the sort of enthusiastic royal endorsement that might have erased every remaining doubt, and the public was still divided. Some had begun accepting Camilla, others had not. For some, she remained permanently associated with Diana's unhappy marriage. For others, she was simply the woman Charles had loved for decades and had finally chosen to marry. Then came the engagement. During a New Year holiday at Burke Hall, Charles proposed. The announcement followed in February 2005, and with it came the ring. That extraordinary diamond was not chosen randomly. According to the source, it had belonged to the Queen Mother. Its Art Deco design dated from the 1930s, with a large square-cut diamond surrounded by smaller stones. To Charles, it was reportedly far more than an engagement ring. It was a message. Camilla was no longer simply the woman beside him. She was becoming part of the royal family, and that made the ring a symbol of legitimacy. For years, the public had debated whether Camilla truly belonged in Charles's life. Now the ring seemed to answer that question without words. Yet even the wedding itself was not entirely straightforward. The ceremony had to be postponed because of the funeral of Pope John Paul II. The location changed from Windsor Castle to the Guildhall, and the wedding itself remained modest by royal standards. On April 9, 2005, Charles and Camilla finally married. There was no grand royal procession, no overwhelming spectacle. Instead, there was a civil ceremony followed by a blessing at St. George's Chapel. Camilla appeared nervous, perhaps understandably. She was not entering a fairy tale. She was entering the final chapter of a journey that had taken decades. And when she stood beside Charles wearing that ring, the symbolism was unmistakable. She was no longer the outsider. She was his wife. And that is precisely why the reported demand to return the ring carries such extraordinary emotional weight. If the account were true, Charles would not simply have been asking for a piece of jewelry. He would have been asking for the return of an object that represented the very moment Camilla's place beside him became official. But there was another problem. The marriage may have survived the wedding. It may have survived the criticism. It may have survived years of public debate. But controversy did not disappear. It simply changed form. Even after Camilla became queen consort, questions about her place in the monarchy continued. For some members of the public, the old controversies never completely disappeared. The relationship with Charles had been examined for decades, and the memory of Diana remained powerful. Then, in 2023, another challenge emerged. This time, it came from inside the family. Prince Harry's memoir, Spare, brought deeply personal royal disputes into the public arena. The book discussed his relationship with the media, the death of his mother, his relationship with William, and the wider tensions within the royal family. But among the most serious accusations was one directed at Camilla. According to the source, Harry accused Camilla of working behind the scenes to improve her public image. He alleged that she had used relationships with the press, and that stories were leaked in ways that benefited her. He described her in deeply critical terms. These were not simply accusations appearing in a newspaper, they were claims presented by Diana's son himself, and that gave them a very different emotional weight. For years, the public had debated Camilla's relationship with the media. Now those debates had been brought directly into a royal memoir. Some people questioned whether Harry's accusations were accurate. Others believed they reflected grievances that had been building for years. But whatever one believed, the effect was unmistakable. The old wounds had reopened, and this time, the disagreement was not between distant commentators in the palace, it was between members of the royal family themselves. According to the source account, Charles was deeply hurt by the attacks on Camilla. He had reportedly spent years hoping to repair his relationship with Harry. Now those efforts appeared even more difficult. Camilla, meanwhile, remained publicly silent. That silence was consistent with the approach she had taken through many previous controversies. She did not publicly fight every accusation. She did not answer every criticism. But the source claims that behind the scenes she was furious. If true, the episode exposed just how fragile the family's internal relationships had become. Harry had stepped away from royal duties, but leaving the institution did not mean leaving the history behind. The arguments continued, the memories remained. And Camilla remained at the center of many of them. Then came the coronation. May 2023 was supposed to mark a new beginning. Charles was becoming king. Camilla was entering the highest position she had ever held. The ceremony should have represented unity. Instead, according to the source account, the family's divisions remained impossible to ignore. Harry attended. Meghan remained in California. Harry's stay in Britain was brief. And his decision to leave shortly afterwards became another reminder of the distance that had grown between him and the rest of the family. To some observers, his absence from the wider celebrations surrounding Camilla's elevation was symbolic. To others, it simply reflected the complicated circumstances surrounding his own position, but the controversy did not end there. The source also claims that Camilla wanted members of her own family to play a larger role in the coronation. Her grandchildren were given prominent ceremonial responsibilities. Some reports suggested that this made William and Catherine uncomfortable. The broader question was whether Camilla was changing the character of the monarchy around her. Was she simply bringing her family into an important national occasion? Or was she creating a new kind of royal household? That debate became particularly sensitive because of the history behind her position. For decades, Camilla had been the outsider. Now she was the queen, and the transformation was enormous. Then came another issue, her title. When Charles and Camilla married in 2005, the expectation had been that she would eventually be known as Princess Consort rather than Queen. That decision had been viewed as a careful response to public sentiment. The memory of Diana remained powerful. The palace knew that Camilla's eventual position would be scrutinized, so the distinction mattered. But shortly before the coronation, the title changed. The word consort disappeared. She became Queen Camilla. For supporters, this represented the reality of her position as the king's wife. For critics, it represented something much more significant. Some believed the original understanding had been abandoned. Others saw it as evidence that Camilla had ultimately achieved the status that many had once believed impossible. And Harry, according to the source account, interpreted the development differently again. To him, it reportedly represented something larger, the idea that Camilla had successfully rewritten her place in royal history. Whether that interpretation was fair or not, the title change demonstrated something important. Camilla's position had changed dramatically. The woman who had once struggled to be accepted was now officially queen, and with greater status came greater scrutiny. There was almost nowhere left for her to hide. Then another controversy emerged. This time, it concerned the people working around the palace. Reports claimed that Camilla had been involved in a major reshuffle. Several long-serving aides were reportedly dismissed. Some insiders, according to the source, believed that Camilla wanted people around her whom she trusted. The implication was that she was seeking greater control over the way the palace operated. One name became particularly associated with the controversy: Angela Kelly, the former dresser and close confidant of Queen Elizabeth II. Kelly had been strongly associated with the late Queen and her personal household. After Elizabeth's death, she was reportedly moved from her Windsor accommodation to a smaller property elsewhere. For some observers, this was seen as another sign that the royal household was changing. The old order was disappearing, a new one was emerging, and Camilla, once the woman struggling to be accepted, was now at the center of it. But just as the arguments over her influence were growing, the royal family faced something far more serious than questions of titles or palace staff: the king's health. In early 2024, the palace announced that Charles had been diagnosed with cancer. Suddenly, the entire atmosphere changed. Royal disagreements became secondary. Public curiosity gave way to concern. The future of the monarchy became a much more serious question, and Camilla's role became even more important. With Charles undergoing treatment, she was required to take on additional responsibilities. For some, this was the moment when she could demonstrate what kind of queen she truly was, not simply the controversial figure from the past, not simply the woman who had survived decades of criticism, but the person standing beside the king when the pressure became greatest. Yet the health crisis also created new uncertainty. What would happen if Charles's condition worsened? Would William have to take on greater responsibility? Would Camilla's influence increase? Could the monarchy remain stable during another period of uncertainty? And beneath all of those questions was a much more personal one. What was happening between Charles and Camilla themselves? Publicly, they continued to appear united. The source account describes Camilla as remaining beside Charles throughout his health struggles. But reports and unnamed sources also continued to suggest that pressures were building behind the scenes. Some claimed Charles relied heavily on Camilla for emotional support. Others suggested that the strain of royal life, public scrutiny, and health concerns had created tension between them. These were claims, not established facts, and that distinction matters, because after decades of rumors surrounding Charles and Camilla, separating what is publicly known from what is merely reported becomes increasingly important. Their marriage had survived enormous public pressure. It had survived the memory of Diana. It had survived criticism from members of the public. It had survived Harry's accusations. It had survived the controversy surrounding Camilla's title, and it had survived the transformation from a deeply controversial relationship into a royal marriage. So could one private confrontation really undo all of that? Could an argument over palace authority truly lead to the return of a ring that had once symbolized their commitment? Or was the reported confrontation simply another dramatic chapter in a marriage that had spent decades under an almost impossible level of scrutiny? That is where the story becomes most difficult to answer, because the source account presents a dramatic version of events in which Charles allegedly ordered Camilla from the palace and demanded her engagement ring. But those claims are presented as reports and allegations. They are not independently established facts within the material itself, and that leaves the most important question unanswered. If the ring was ever truly demanded back, what would that actually mean? Would it represent the collapse of the marriage? A moment of anger? A symbolic gesture? Or simply a story that grew larger as it moved through the machinery of royal rumor? There is something almost poetic about the idea of that ring returning to the palace. For decades, it had traveled through one of the most complicated love stories in modern royal history. It had represented separation and reunion, controversy and acceptance, a private relationship becoming a public marriage, a woman once viewed as an outsider becoming queen, and now, according to the report, that same object had supposedly become a symbol of conflict. But perhaps the deeper story is not really about the ring at all. It is about how much pressure can be placed on two people when their marriage is never allowed to belong entirely to them. Charles and Camilla have lived their relationship beneath an extraordinary level of public attention. Their choices have been examined. Their words have been scrutinized. Their family disagreements have become national conversation. Even the jewelry they wear has acquired historical meaning. And that makes every reported disagreement seem larger than an ordinary marital dispute, because when the people involved are king and queen, private emotion can quickly become public consequence. The question is therefore not simply whether Charles and Camilla had a confrontation, It is whether the pressures surrounding their marriage have reached a point where even the strongest symbols of their relationship can become instruments of conflict. For years, the palace worked to transform Camilla's image. The outsider became the accepted partner. The controversial figure became the king's wife. The wife became queen consort, and eventually, simply, Queen Camilla. That journey was not easy. It took decades. It required patience. It required political and institutional caution, and above all, it required Charles to remain committed to a relationship that had once seemed almost impossible, which is why the alleged demand for the ring would be so significant. Because you cannot understand the meaning of that moment without understanding everything that came before it. The diamond was never merely a diamond. It carried the memory of the Queen Mother. It carried the symbolism of Charles's proposal. It carried the history of a relationship that had endured enormous opposition, and it carried the transformation of Camilla's position within the royal family. So if that symbol was ever placed back on a palace table, it would raise a question far more profound than who owned the jewelry. Was Charles simply angry? Was Camilla simply defending her independence? Or had something fundamental changed between them? For now, based on the account before us, there is no definitive answer. What remains is a story filled with claims, competing interpretations, and a marriage that has already survived more controversy than most relationships could withstand. But perhaps that is precisely why the story continues to fascinate. Because after everything Charles and Camilla have endured, one question still refuses to disappear. How much more can this marriage withstand? And if the reported confrontation really did happen, perhaps the most important chapter has not yet been written. Because the real test of any royal marriage is not what happens when the world is watching. It is what happens when the doors close, the palace becomes silent, and two people are left to decide what comes next.